August 17th, 1943. The sky over Schweinfurt, Germany. At 4,000 meters, a Messerschmitt Bf-109 spirals out of control, trailing black smoke over the ball bearing factories that fed the entire German war machine. The pilot fights the stick for 3 seconds too long before punching through the canopy. As his parachute opens, he looks up, and what he sees makes him forget, for a moment, that he is falling toward enemy territory. An American bomber formation stretching from one horizon to the other. Not dozens of aircraft, hundreds. Escorted by fighters with a range German intelligence had sworn in briefing after briefing was physically impossible. He does not know it yet, but in 3 days he will be captured, crossing a French farmer's field on foot. And that capture will place him inside a system that was never really designed to extract military secrets. It was designed to quietly take apart everything he believed about his own country's chances of winning. This is the story of the Luftwaffe pilots who fell into American hands, and what their interrogations, letters, and post-war testimony revealed about a production machine they had been told did not exist.
Before we go further, it's worth understanding exactly who these men were. The Luftwaffe pilots captured in 1943 and 1944 were not improvised soldiers pulled off a farm and handed a rifle. Fighter pilots, in particular, came disproportionately from Germany's educated classes: engineers, sons of industrialists, men with half-finished doctorates interrupted by the war. This detail matters more than it looks like it should, because it meant that when these men were confronted with American production numbers, they couldn't simply wave them away as propaganda. They knew how to read a factory floor. They understood, instinctively, what a given rate of aluminum consumption per hour actually implied about a nation's industrial base. They were captured 3 main ways. Some were shot down in aerial combat and parachuted directly into Allied-held territory. Others ran out of fuel, a fate that became almost routine by late 1944, and were forced to belly land wherever the tank ran dry. And a smaller number bailed out over enemy lines and were rounded up on the ground, sometimes within hours, sometimes after days of hiding in barns and hedgerows. Unlike infantry soldiers, who were frequently captured in large groups, entire companies surrendering together, still surrounded by the psychological cover of shared disbelief, pilots arrived alone. One man, no unit, no comrades. To quietly validate the idea that what they were seeing might not be real.
That isolation, it turns out, made them close to ideal subjects for what came next. Most pilots captured in the European theater passed first through a temporary holding and interrogation point in England, where basic identification and initial questioning took place. From there, a select group, those judged to have useful technical or operational knowledge, were quietly transferred across the Atlantic. Most had no idea where they were actually going. Some assumed a prison. Some assumed worse. What awaited them instead was a room with real coffee, an interrogator who spoke flawless Berlin German, and a question none of them expected to hear.
The destination for most of these pilots was a secret compound on the outskirts of Alexandria, Virginia, known to almost no one by its real name. Officially, it existed only as a mailing address, P.O. Box 1142. Its real name was Fort Hunt. The contrast with German interrogation methods was, by design, almost total. At Dulag Luft, the Luftwaffe's own interrogation center for captured Allied airmen, psychological pressure, isolation, and occasionally harsher treatment were standard tools. At Fort Hunt, American intelligence took a different approach, one built on patience rather than coercion, officially bound by strict adherence to the Geneva Convention. The interrogators themselves were often the first shock. A significant number were German Jewish refugees, men and women who had fled Nazi persecution years earlier, who spoke the language not as students, but as native speakers, who understood German military culture from the inside. They built rapport deliberately. They offered cigarettes, coffee, sometimes simply conversation about home, family, before ever asking an operational question.
What the prisoners didn't know was that every room was wired. Pilots were often housed 2 or 3 to a cell, encouraged, subtly, informally, to talk freely with one another once the official interrogation session ended. Guards would leave, doors would close, and the men would relax, certain they were finally alone. They weren't. Every word was recorded, transcribed, and cross-referenced against what other prisoners had said in other rooms down the same hallway. One radio communications officer, captured after his Focke-Wulf 190 was shot down over Normandy, described the shock of his first days in captivity in a memoir published nearly 2 decades after the war. The interrogator who greeted him spoke in the unmistakable accent of Berlin, offered him real coffee, something he hadn't tasted in months, and before he had said a single word about his squadron, already seemed to know its entire chain of command. "I understood in that first hour," he wrote, "that whatever these people wanted from us, they did not need to beat it out of us. They already knew more about the Luftwaffe than most of our own staff officers did." But the deepest damage wasn't done by interrogation technique at all. It came from something almost accidental. Numbers that slipped out during long, unhurried, seemingly off-the-record conversations. Numbers that the Americans mentioned, the way you'd mention the weather.
By 1944, the United States was producing more than 96,000 aircraft a year, nearly double Germany's entire wartime aircraft output, crammed into a single 12-month span. At Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan, a fully assembled B-24 Liberator bomber rolled off the line roughly every 63 minutes, around the clock. North American Aviation's plants in Inglewood, California, and Dallas, Texas, together turned out more than 350 P-51 Mustang fighters a month by early 1944. Precisely the aircraft whose impossible range had stunned German pilots during their first disastrous escort encounters over the Reich. One Bf-109 pilot, captured shortly after the Normandy invasion, later described being shown, almost by accident, by a junior intelligence officer simply killing time between formal sessions, a stack of monthly aircraft delivery reports sitting on a desk. "He wasn't trying to intimidate me," the pilot wrote in a letter that was later declassified, along with hundreds of others from the Fort Hunt archive. "He was doing paperwork. I saw a number for a single month's fighter deliveries that exceeded everything the Reich Air Ministry claimed to have produced in an entire year." German pilots had been raised, professionally and ideologically, on the assurance that American industry was overextended, that domestic shortages, labor unrest, and civilian consumer demand would cripple military output well before 1943 was over. Instead, what leaked into these conversations painted a different picture entirely. Aluminum supplies so abundant that entire training squadrons flew missions purely to accumulate flight hours for green pilots, a luxury the fuel-starved Luftwaffe had been forced to abandon by the middle of 1944, when veteran instructors were being pulled from training commands and sent to the front simply to have enough bodies in cockpits. Some of the numbers were almost too large to process emotionally. A single American engine plant, one prisoner learned during a supervised work assignment months later, consumed more electricity in a single day than his entire home district used in a week. Another, recorded in a letter home that never reached its destination and was instead filed away by censors, that a single American assembly line produced more finished fighter aircraft in 1 month than his entire Gruppe, the equivalent of a full fighter wing, had received as replacements over an entire year of combat. None of these numbers, however large, hit quite as hard as what came next. Perhaps the single most damaging revelation these pilots absorbed during captivity had nothing to do with aircraft numbers at all. It had to do with fuel, and by extension, with the one resource no amount of German engineering brilliance could substitute for. By late 1944, German fighter pilots were being sent into combat after as little as 10 hours of flight training. 10 hours total, before facing battle-hardened American formations, flying aircraft with superior range, superior altitude performance, and pilots who had trained for months, not days. This catastrophic shortfall was a direct consequence of the collapse of Germany's synthetic fuel production after Allied strategic bombing campaigns systematically targeted the Lena and Politz synthetic oil plants throughout 1944. Captured pilots described the shortage with a particular, specific bitterness in their interrogation transcripts, bitterness that stands out even against the general despair of defeat. Young Luftwaffe cadets, some barely out of their teens, were being thrown into combat against seasoned American pilots with barely enough flight hours to safely land an aircraft, let alone outmaneuver one in a dogfight.
When American interrogators mentioned, again, almost incidentally, without any apparent intention to wound, that U.S. fighter pilots routinely logged over 300 hours of flight training before their very first combat sortie, several captured pilots are recorded as having gone completely silent for the remainder of the session. Not defiant silence, something closer to grief. A former Gruppenkommandeur, a group commander captured in the war's final months in early 1945, put the realization into words years later in a post-war interview that was eventually archived alongside other Luftwaffe veteran testimonies. "We were not defeated by better pilots," he said. "Many of ours, back in 1940, were the finest in the world, genuinely, not as propaganda. We were defeated by a nation that could afford to train a boy for an entire year before letting him anywhere near a cockpit, while we were sending boys up after 10 hours, because we simply had nothing left to give them. Not fuel, not instructors, not time." This is the moment, more than any single production statistic, where captured pilots stopped arguing. Not because they had run out of counter-arguments to offer their captors. The Americans, notably, rarely pressed the point or gloated. They stopped arguing with themselves. Before we move into the prison camps themselves, which is where this story gets a lot more personal and, honestly, a lot stranger, drop a comment below. Do you think you'd have believed these numbers just from hearing them secondhand? Or would it have taken seeing it with your own eyes, the way these pilots were about to? Pilots who survived interrogation weren't kept at Fort Hunt indefinitely. Like the rest of the roughly 425,000 Axis prisoners of war held in the United States during the conflict, they were eventually dispersed into the vast network of POW camps spread across the American interior, camps in Texas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, Kansas, and dozens of other states most of these men had never heard of before the war. For men trained as engineers and technicians, and again, a disproportionate share of Luftwaffe officers held technical backgrounds, the sight of ordinary American civil infrastructure delivered a second, quieter shock. One that in some ways cut deeper than anything they'd heard in an interrogation room, because it wasn't a number on a page, it was in front of them. One pilot, transferred to a camp in Oklahoma and later assigned to supervised agricultural labor under standard wartime labor programs, wrote about watching a local farmer's crop dusting aircraft, a simple single-engine biplane, used casually to spray fields, get repaired by a local mechanic in under 20 minutes, using replacement parts pulled straight out of a hardware catalog. No rationing forms, no requisition chain, no waiting. "In Germany," he wrote, in a letter later preserved in a regional archive, "by 1944, we were cannibalizing 3 broken aircraft just to keep one flying. Here, a farmer used an airplane the same way we used a tractor, as a simple,
replaceable tool, not a scarce and precious weapon. Camp conditions themselves reinforced the same pattern from a different angle entirely. Food was abundant, often startlingly so compared to what these men had been eating in the field, and in many cases, compared to what German civilians back home were eating under wartime rationing. Camp medical facilities frequently had equipment that many German civilian hospitals had already lost access to by 1944. And the sheer domestic normality of it all, working radios, current newspapers, Hollywood films shown in camp theaters, stood in stark, almost surreal contrast to the blackout regulations and rationing they'd left behind. For pilots specifically, there was one more detail that stung in a very particular way: fuel. Civilian farm vehicles, tractors, even the crop duster mentioned above, ran freely on gasoline that would have been treated as a precious military asset back home. The same resource that had cost countless young Luftwaffe cadets their training hours, and in many cases their lives, was being used here to spray insecticide on a wheat field.
After repatriation, a number of former Luftwaffe pilots became key sources for Allied studies of German aviation, and in turn, spoke with striking candor about what captivity had taught them regarding the war's real balance of power. Their debriefs fed directly into the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, a massive post-war analytical effort that combined pilot testimony with captured German production records to map in precise detail exactly how far American industrial capacity had outpaced Germany's by the war's final year. The conclusions were stark. German aircraft production had, in raw numbers, actually increased through much of 1944, thanks to dispersed and underground manufacturing that partially evaded Allied bombing. But it didn't matter. The bottleneck was never really the airframes. It was fuel, trained pilots, and time. Three resources that couldn't be manufactured underground, no matter how determined the engineers. One former commander, addressing a gathering of former Luftwaffe officers decades later at a veterans reunion in the 1970s, summarized what many of his contemporaries had only fully accepted after the fact, in the quiet of peacetime. We fought with courage against an opponent who did not need courage to win. They needed factories, and they had more of them than we could ever have truly imagined, running day and night, guarded by nothing more than the simple confidence that we could never reach them.
The Luftwaffe pilots who fell into American hands didn't surrender their information under torture or coercion. They surrendered it in quiet rooms, over coffee, in the accidental candor of interrogators who no longer felt any real need to hide America's numbers, because by 1944, the numbers themselves had become the entire argument. There was nothing left to conceal. They had fallen from the sky believing deeply and sincerely in German technical superiority. They walked out of captivity understanding that the war in the air had already been decided somewhere they never once saw. On assembly lines in Michigan, in Texas, in California, where the true battle for air supremacy had been fought and won long before their aircraft ever left the ground. If this story hit you the way it hit me putting it together, let me know in the comments which pilot story stuck with you the most. And tell me which one you want next: Japanese fighter pilots captured in the Pacific, or the German scientists from Operation Alsos who saw the Manhattan Project up close.